Have you ever wondered why certain names vanish from history books while others remain forever? What happens when someone becomes so dangerous to the powerful that erasing their existence becomes the only option? Tonight, I need to tell you something that colonial authorities, sultanates, and even modern historians have desperately tried to bury for nearly 2 centuries. In 1844, on an island most people cannot locate on a map, something happened at a slave auction that changed the entire trajectory of East African resistance. The woman at the center of this story had a name that was deliberately scratched from every official document, every merchant ledger, every naval report. And I found out why. What she did during the monsoon season of that year sent shockwaves through the Indian Ocean trade routes, forced the British Navy to rewrite their protocols, and created a method of resistance that would be whispered about in holding cells from Mozambique to Oman for the next 50 years. If you are someone who believes that hidden truths deserve to see the light, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand the history of human trafficking in East Africa. Stay with me until the end, because the final twist in this story is something no documentary has ever dared to tell. The ruins still stand on the western shore of Unguja, the main island of the Zanzibar archipelago, though most tourists walk past them without a second glance. Where the old stone market once dominated the waterfront, fragments of coral block walls now crumble into the tide, their surfaces still bearing the dark stains that no amount of monsoon rain has managed to wash clean in 180 years. The air in this place carries a particular weight, a thickness that locals attribute to the memories trapped in the coral itself, the same porous stone that absorbed the screams, the negotiations, the desperate final glances between mothers and children who would never see each other again. At low tide, when the turquoise waters retreat and expose the foundations of the old auction platforms, elderly fishermen still refuse to cast their nets in that direction. They speak of shadows that move wrong, of voices that rise from the exposed coral when the wind dies and the dhows sit motionless in the harbor. The British built their cathedral directly over the main auction site in 1873, as if concrete and crosses could somehow sanctify ground that had witnessed the sale of over 50,000 human beings in the decades before abolition. But the land remembers, the coral remembers, and somewhere in the depths of the Zanzibar National Archives, in a locked cabinet that requires 3 separate keys held by 3 different officials who have never met, there exists a collection of documents that the Omani Sultanate, the British colonial administration, and the modern Tanzanian government have all agreed should never be made public. Those documents contain the name of a woman who, in the span of a single night during the clove harvest of 1844, orchestrated an event so catastrophic to the slave trade that every authority with a stake in human commerce decided unanimously that she had never existed. This is her story. This is what they did not want you to know. If you want to follow more cases like this, that shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any investigation. Zanzibar in the 1840s operated as the undisputed capital of the East African slave trade, a position it had held with increasing dominance since Sultan Sayyid Said relocated his court from Muscat in 1840. The island measured roughly 90 kilometers in length and 30 in width, but within that modest geography existed one of the most sophisticated and brutal commercial systems the world had ever produced. The Stone Town waterfront stretched for nearly 2 kilometers, a dense maze of narrow streets and multi-story buildings constructed from the island's distinctive coral rag, their carved wooden doors serving as the only indication of the wealth or poverty contained within. Behind these facades, in courtyards invisible from the street, the actual business of empire took place. The main slave market occupied a plaza near the Malindi waterfront, an open area of packed earth approximately 60 meters square, surrounded by holding cells carved into the foundations of adjacent merchant houses. Here, on any given day during the trading season that ran from March through October, between 200 and 400 human beings would be displayed, examined, and sold to buyers representing interests from Arabia, Persia, India, and the French colonial territories in the Indian Ocean. The auction process followed protocols refined over centuries, beginning before dawn when the captives were brought from the underground holding cells where they had been kept, sometimes for weeks, in darkness so complete that many emerged temporarily blind. Attendants would wash them in seawater, rub coconut oil into their skin to create the appearance of health and vitality, and force them to perform simple exercises to demonstrate their physical capacity. Those who resisted were beaten with strips of hippopotamus hide until their will dissolved. Those who wept were beaten harder, for tears suggested an unacceptably strong attachment to a past life that buyers found inconvenient. Children under the age of 10 were separated from their mothers approximately 30 minutes before the auction began, a timing calculated precisely to allow the initial hysteria to exhaust itself while leaving enough visible distress to create opportunities for buyers seeking to acquire both at a reduced combined price. The actual bidding commenced at 9 in the morning, conducted by professional auctioneers licensed by the Sultanate, their voices carrying across the plaza in a rhythmic Swahili that mixed Arabic numerals with Bantu descriptions of physical attributes. A healthy adult male in his 20s might fetch between 20 and 30 Maria Teresa thalers, the heavy silver coins that served as the standard currency of the Indian Ocean trade. Women of childbearing age commanded similar prices, with premiums for those who showed signs of previous successful pregnancies. Children were sold by estimated potential, their teeth examined like livestock, their joints manipulated to predict future growth and strength. And presiding over all of this, from carved wooden balconies that jutted from the surrounding buildings, sat the merchants who had transformed human misery into one of the most profitable enterprises in the 19th century world. Among the wealthiest of these was a man whose name appears in British consular reports as Hamad bin Mohammed al-Murjebi, though the enslaved populations who labored in his clove plantations north of Stonetown knew him by a different designation entirely. They called him the Collector, a title earned through his particular fascination with acquiring human beings who possessed unusual skills, rare talents, or exceptional physical characteristics that might prove useful or simply entertaining. His plantation complex sprawled across nearly 4,000 acres of prime agricultural land in the interior, centered on a main house that visitors described as rivaling anything in Muscat for its architectural ambition and far exceeding it for the cruelty with which its construction and maintenance were achieved. Amara had been on the island for 11 years by the spring of 1844, long enough to have witnessed the complete transformation of Zanzibar from a minor Portuguese-influenced backwater into the gleaming commercial capital of East African exploitation. She had arrived in 1833, part of a coffle of 63 captives marched from the shores of Lake Nyassa through 800 kilometers of territory that would later become Tanganyika, surviving a passage that killed 27 of her original group before they even reached the coast at Kilwa. She was 14 years old when the Arab traders purchased her from the Yao middlemen, who had captured her village, already marked as different by the scar tissue that covered her hands, the distinctive calluses of a blacksmith's apprentice. Her father had been the ironworker for a cluster of villages near the lake's southern shore, and from the age of 7, she had learned to read the color of heated metal, to judge the precise moment when iron became malleable enough to shape, but not so soft, that it would lose its integrity. This knowledge saved her life during the march to the coast, when a trader's flintlock mechanism broke, and no one among the Arab merchants or their African auxiliaries possessed the skill to repair it. Amara fixed the weapon in under an hour, using only a small fire, a rock as an anvil, and a piece of salvaged metal she shaped into the necessary spring. The head trader, recognizing the value of what he had just witnessed, immediately separated her from the general coffle and assigned her to the group of skilled captives who would be sold at premium prices in Zanzibar. She arrived on the island during the southwest monsoon, her first sight of the Indian Ocean, a wall of gray water and white foam that seemed to merge seamlessly with an equally gray sky. The Collector purchased her within a week of her arrival for the extraordinary sum of 52 thalers, more than double the price of an ordinary adult woman, on the basis of a demonstration in which she repaired 3 broken agricultural implements in front of an audience of skeptical overseers. For the next 11 years, Amara served as the primary metal worker for the Collector's entire plantation operation, responsible for maintaining the hundreds of tools required to cultivate, harvest, and process the cloves that had become the island's most valuable export. She forged new blades, repaired broken mechanisms, fabricated the iron components of the carts and presses that transformed raw cloves into the dried spice that would be shipped to markets in India, Arabia, and Europe. Her workshop occupied a stone building at the edge of the plantation's main compound, positioned close enough to the overseer's quarters that her movements could be monitored, but far enough from the field laborer's barracks that she existed in a strange social limbo, trusted with fire and iron while never trusted with freedom. The collector visited her workshop regularly, fascinated by the process of metalworking in a way that seemed almost childlike, despite the sophisticated cruelty he demonstrated in every other aspect of his existence. He would stand in the doorway for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, watching her work the bellows, shape the heated metal, quench the finished product in the stone trough of water that dominated one corner of the space. He never touched her in the way that plantation owners typically touched enslaved women, a restraint that other captives found almost more disturbing than the alternative, as if he viewed her as a prize specimen too valuable to risk damaging. And Amara, across those 11 years, watched him with equal intensity, cataloging his habits, his weaknesses, his predictable patterns of movement and attention. She learned the layout of the main house, the schedules of the guards, the location of the armory where the collector kept the weapons that enforced his authority over nearly 800 enslaved laborers. She learned which overseers drank too much palm wine on their nights off, which guards could be distracted by certain conversations, which storage buildings were checked infrequently because their contents were considered too mundane to attract theft. She learned all of this not with any specific plan in mind, but with the patient accumulation of intelligence that characterized survivors, those who understood that knowledge itself was a form of power, even when no opportunity to use it seemed imminent. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The escalation began in January of 1844, 6 months before the events that would be erased from official records. A new overseer arrived at the plantation, a man named Rashid, whose previous posting had been at one of the Sultan's clove operations on Pemba Island, the smaller landmass visible on clear days from Zanzibar's northern beaches. Rashid brought with him techniques of labor extraction that even the collector's existing staff found extreme, methods refined during a career that had established him as one of the most productive and most feared managers in the entire Sultanate. His first act upon arrival was to increase the daily harvest quotas for field laborers by 40%, a demand that could only be met by extending working hours from the existing 14 to nearly 18 per day. Those who failed to meet the new quotas faced punishments calibrated to maximize suffering while minimizing damage to their productive capacity, a calculation that Rashid had elevated to something approaching an art form. He favored stress positions, forcing captives to hold painful postures for hours at a time, their muscles screaming, their joints slowly separating, while he sat nearby in a wooden chair sipping sweetened tea and commenting on their technique. He understood that a whipping left scars that reduced the resale value of a slave, but a night spent with arms bound behind the back and legs forced into impossible angles left no visible marks while delivering equivalent agony. He introduced a system of collective punishment that transformed the natural human tendency toward community into a mechanism of control, declaring that any individual's failure to meet quota would result in reduced rations for an entire work unit of 20 laborers. This ensured that the strongest workers would pressure the weakest, that the healthy would resent the sick, that the very bonds of solidarity that might otherwise have formed the foundation of resistance were instead converted into chains more effective than any iron the collector's warehouses contained. Amara watched all of this from her workshop, her position as a skilled specialist giving her a strange invisibility, a freedom of movement that field laborers did not possess. She heard the screams that began before dawn and continued well after dark. She treated the injuries that the plantation's inadequate medical system could not address, using her metalworking skills to create splints, to remove embedded thorns and fragments of metal from wounds that had been allowed to fester, to heat blades for the cauterization of infections that would otherwise have proved fatal. She kept count, in her mind, of the deaths. 3 in January. 5 in February. 7 in March. Each one a person she had known, had spoken with, had seen walking to the fields with the particular shuffle of exhaustion that defined life on the collector's plantation. And with each death, something hardened within her, a crystallization of rage that she kept carefully hidden behind the mask of competent submission that had protected her for more than a decade. The transformation from endurance to active planning occurred on a Thursday in April, during the brief window between the end of the northeastern monsoon and the beginning of the clove harvest. Amara's younger sister, Zara, had arrived on the island 3 years earlier, part of a different coffle captured in a raid on villages further south along the lake shore. Finding each other had been a miracle of patience and careful inquiry, a process that took nearly 18 months of whispered questions through the networks of communication that linked the island's various plantations. Zara worked in the collector's main house, one of a staff of 20 domestic servants responsible for the cooking, cleaning, and personal attendance that the merchant's lifestyle required. She was 23 years old, small and quick, with their mother's eyes and their father's stubborn jaw. The sisters saw each other approximately once per week, during the brief Sunday afternoon rest period, when domestic and field staff were occasionally permitted to mingle in the common area near the plantation's central well. These meetings were conducted in code, in the shared language of glances and gestures that they had developed as children playing in the tall grass near their village, a vocabulary of silence that no overseer could interpret. On that Thursday in April, Amara noticed immediately that something had changed. Zara moved differently, her usual quickness replaced by a careful gait that suggested pain with every step. Her eyes, normally bright with the defiant humor that had carried her through 3 years of domestic servitude, were flat and empty in a way that Amara had seen before, in the expressions of women who had survived specific violations that left the body technically intact while shattering something fundamental within. Amara did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. The collector had finally decided that Zara was not too valuable to damage, or perhaps he had simply grown bored with restraint. It did not matter which. What mattered was the absolute certainty that settled into Amara's bones during the 3-minute conversation they shared near the well, a conversation in which Zara said nothing directly, and Amara said nothing at all, but in which everything necessary was communicated. That night, in her workshop, Amara sat before her forge and did not sleep. She watched the coals dim from orange to red to gray, and in that gradual darkening she saw, for the first time clearly, the shape of what she was going to do. Not might do, not could do, was going to do, with the inevitability of iron cooling into its final form. The collector embodied everything that made the Zanzibar slave trade not merely evil in some abstract moral sense, but specifically, personally, intimately destructive to every human being caught within its machinery. His cruelty was not the hot cruelty of anger or the cold cruelty of indifference, but something more disturbing, a considered cruelty, an intellectual cruelty that approached the infliction of suffering as a problem to be optimized. Born to a merchant family in Muscat that had traded in enslaved people for 4 generations, he had arrived in Zanzibar in 1835 with capital, connections, and a philosophy of human property that viewed biological needs not as inconveniences to be managed, but as leverage to be exploited. He understood that hunger made people compliant, that thirst made them desperate, that the threat of separation from loved ones could motivate labor more effectively than any whip. His plantation was notorious throughout the island, not for the visible brutality that characterized some operations, but for the subtle systems of control that made resistance seem not just dangerous, but genuinely impossible. He maintained an intelligence network among his own enslaved population, encouraging informants with small privileges that created divisions and resentments, transforming the natural human desire for any improvement in circumstances into a weapon against solidarity. He conducted periodic random punishments that bore no clear relationship to any specific offense, teaching his laborers that their suffering was fundamentally arbitrary, that nothing they did or failed to do could guarantee safety. But if the collector represented the sophisticated face of the slave trade's horror, the catalyst for what Amara would eventually set in motion came from elsewhere entirely. In early May, a British naval vessel arrived in Stone Town Harbor, one of the ships tasked with enforcing the treaties that theoretically limited the slave trade's geographic scope. The captain, a man named Harold Fenwick, had served on the anti-slavery patrol for 7 years, and had developed a particular disgust for the gap between his government's official position and the reality of what he witnessed in Zanzibar's markets. He carried orders to observe and report, not to intervene, but during his 3-day stay in port, he allowed himself to be drawn into a conversation with several American missionaries who had established a small presence on the island. These missionaries, working under the protection of ambiguous diplomatic arrangements, had been documenting conditions on the various plantations, and had recently obtained testimony from a survivor of the collector's operation, a man who had escaped during a transfer between properties and made his way to the missionaries' compound before colonial authorities could recapture him. Fenwick read the testimony in a single sitting and emerged looking, according to the missionaries' own records, physically ill. The document described specific incidents, named specific overseers, detailed specific methods of torture and control that the British captain had believed existed only in the most sensationalized anti-slavery literature. More significantly, the testimony included information about an upcoming event that the collector was planning for the full moon of June, a private auction at which he would sell a selected group of particularly valuable enslaved people to a gathering of the island's wealthiest merchants. This was not an ordinary commercial transaction. The testimony suggested it was something closer to a social occasion, an opportunity for the collector to demonstrate his status and his inventory to his peers while conducting business that he preferred to keep separate from the public markets. Fenwick, bound by orders he could not disobey, did nothing with this information directly, but he mentioned it, in passing, to one of the missionaries, who mentioned it to a Zanzibari convert who served as a translator for the mission, who mentioned it to a free woman who sold vegetables in the Stone Town market, who mentioned it to her cousin who worked as a cook at a plantation adjacent to the collector's property, who mentioned it to a man named Kofi, who had been trading information with Amara for nearly 3 years. The humiliation that crystallized Amara's resolve into specific action came during the second week of May, at an event designed explicitly to break her. Word had reached the collector, through his network of informants, that someone in the workshop compound had been asking questions about the upcoming private auction. The questions themselves were innocuous enough, inquiries about timing and logistics that could have had any number of innocent explanations. But the collector understood that knowledge was dangerous and responded accordingly. He summoned Amara to the main house courtyard during the busiest hour of the afternoon, when the maximum number of laborers returning from the fields would witness what was about to occur. She stood in the center of the packed earth space while the collector circled her slowly, speaking not to her, but to the assembled audience of overseers and domestic staff and field workers frozen at the compound's edges. He spoke about gratitude, about the privileges that skilled laborers enjoyed while their brothers and sisters suffered in the fields, about the importance of remembering one's place in the order of things. He spoke about curiosity as a disease, about questions as a symptom of this disease, about the cure that he was about to administer. Then, he ordered her to kneel. For the next 2 hours, while the sun moved across the sky and the assembled witnesses were forbidden to leave, Amara knelt on the hard-packed earth with her arms extended horizontally. Weights hung from her wrists that increased every 15 minutes. The collector sat in a chair brought from the main house, sipping water and occasionally commenting on her posture, her breathing, the trembling that began in her shoulders and gradually consumed her entire body. When she finally collapsed, he had her carried back to her workshop and deposited on the floor with instructions that she was to receive no food or water until she completed repairs on a list of implements that he knew would take 3 days to finish even under optimal conditions. As Amara lay on the workshop floor that night, her shoulders screaming from the damage done to ligaments and tendons, her lips cracked with thirst, her mind clear with a crystalline focus that she had never experienced before, she made the decision that would change everything. She would attend the private auction, not as a victim, not as merchandise, as something else entirely. The planning began the following morning and continued for exactly 3 weeks, conducted in fragments of whispered conversation, in coded gestures exchanged during permitted rest periods, in the careful assembly of materials, and the cultivation of relationships that had been years in the making. Amara identified her core collaborators with the precision of a general selecting officers for a campaign. Kofi, whose information network extended throughout Stone Town, and whose hatred for the system that had enslaved him burned with a cold and patient flame. Bahati, a woman who worked in the main house kitchen and had access to the stores of palm wine and imported spirits that would be served at the auction. Mwamba, an elderly man who had been the collector's head gardener for 20 years, and knew the layout of the property better than any overseer. And Zara, whose position in the domestic staff would provide crucial intelligence about the movements and arrangements for the event itself. Each recruit was approached separately, the proposition delivered in language so oblique that anyone overhearing would have understood only that a favor was being requested. But those who were approached understood immediately what was actually being offered. They understood because they had been waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for someone to give form and direction to the rage that they had carried silently for years, decades, entire lifetimes. The method took shape gradually, emerging from conversations about what resources were available and what vulnerabilities the target presented. The collector would gather the island's wealthiest merchants in his main house for an evening of entertainment, demonstration, and commerce. Approximately 40 guests were expected, along with their personal servants and guards, the collector's own security force, and the enslaved people who would be presented for sale. The main house was a 3-story coral stone structure with limited exits, designed more for impressing visitors than for rapid evacuation. The clove stores adjacent to the main compound contained nearly 2 tons of dried product, the result of the previous year's harvest, awaiting shipment to markets in India. Cloves, when dried, were extraordinarily flammable. This was known. What was less well known, what Amara understood from her years of working with fire and understanding its properties, was that dried cloves did not merely burn. When ignited in large quantities, they released oils that created fires of unusual intensity and speed, fires that could not be extinguished with water alone, fires that produced smoke so thick and so acrid that it could incapacitate even those at considerable distance from the initial blaze. The plan called for simultaneous ignitions at 5 separate points around the plantation compound, timed to coincide with the moment when the auction itself would be in progress, and the maximum number of targets would be concentrated in the main house. Escape routes would be blocked, not physically but through the strategic placement of fires that would cut off access to the paths leading away from the property. The enslaved population would receive advance warning through the communication network that Kofi maintained, ensuring that they could reach positions of safety before the chaos began. The overseers and guards, caught between the fires and their instinct to protect their employer's property, would face impossible choices. And the collector's guests, the men whose wealth derived from human suffering, would find themselves trapped in a burning building, with no one willing to risk their lives to save them. Amara called the plan by a name that existed only in the language her father had taught her before her capture, a word that meant approximately the return of fire to those who have stolen the warmth from others. In the weeks that followed, others would give it different names. The British would call it the Zanzibar incident. The Omani authorities would call it the June catastrophe. The enslaved populations who heard about it through whispers and songs and stories passed from generation to generation would call it something simpler: the night the island burned. The eve of the auction arrived with the oppressive stillness that preceded the southwest monsoon, the air so thick with moisture that breathing felt like drinking, and every movement left trails of sweat that evaporated too slowly to provide relief. In the main house, preparations for the collector's event had transformed the normally austere spaces into something approaching decadent beauty. Carpets brought from Persia covering the coral stone floors, oil lamps positioned to cast flattering light on the wealth displayed in every corner, musicians tuning instruments in the courtyard where Amara had knelt just 3 weeks earlier. The guests began arriving shortly after sunset, their dhows and small boats crossing from Stone Town in a procession visible from the plantation's watchtower, lanterns bobbing across the darkening water like earthbound stars moving against the current. The collector greeted each arrival personally, his silk robes and embroidered cap presenting the image of civilized prosperity that he had worked decades to cultivate. Wine flowed freely, and palm wine for those who preferred local tastes, and imported spirits for those who affected European sophistication. The enslaved servants moved through the gathering like ghosts, refilling cups and removing empty platters and never meeting the eyes of any guest. In her workshop, Amara completed the final preparations. The ignition devices were simple in design, but reliable, oil-soaked ropes of specific lengths that would burn at predictable rates, providing the 15 to 20 minutes necessary for the conspirators to reach their positions and the enslaved population to move to safety. She had tested each rope 3 times in secret, measuring burn rates and adjusting lengths until the timing was precise within a margin of 2 minutes. The ropes were now distributed to the 5 ignition points, hidden beneath loose stones and piles of dried leaves, waiting for the signals that would be delivered when the auction reached its height. Kofi had confirmed that the boats used by the guests would be disabled, their moorings loosened in ways that would become apparent only when attempted use revealed that oars had been removed and sails had been cut. Bahati had prepared the particular batch of palm wine that would be served to the guards during their evening meal, a vintage enhanced with extracts of local plants that would not incapacitate immediately, but would slow reflexes and cloud judgment over the following hours. Mwamba had identified the positions from which the fires would spread most effectively, accounting for the evening breeze that would push flames toward the main house while sparing the laborers' barracks on the compound's far eastern edge. And Zara, inside the main house, had established the observation post from which she would deliver the signal that would set everything in motion. 3 flashes of light from an upper window, visible to the watchers positioned around the compound's perimeter. The auction began at approximately 9 o'clock, when the collector led his guests from the main reception room to the adjacent space that had been prepared specifically for the evening's commerce. 37 human beings stood arranged in rows, their skin oiled, their postures maintained by the overseer Rashid, who circulated among them with a short whip that he occasionally used to correct any deviation from the prescribed stance. The guests examined the merchandise with the casual expertise of men who had evaluated human property all their lives, checking teeth, squeezing muscles, asking questions about origins and skills and previous ownership that the collector answered with the smooth patter of a dealer who knew his inventory intimately. The bidding began with the youngest, a boy of approximately 8 years who had been captured 6 months earlier, and whose value lay primarily in his potential, the years of labor that his healthy frame promised to deliver. He sold for $18 to a merchant from Pemba who specialized in coffee cultivation and preferred to train workers from childhood. A woman in her 30s followed, a skilled weaver whose products had been displayed in the main house as examples of the craftsmanship available for purchase. She sold for 42 thalers, a price that reflected both her skills and her remaining years of productive capacity. Each sale followed the same pattern: presentation, examination, bidding, conclusion. The collector maintained detailed records in a leather-bound ledger, his Arabic script flowing across the page with the practiced ease of a man who had recorded thousands of such transactions. By 10:30, 17 of the 37 had been sold, and the evening was proceeding exactly as planned. Rashid circulated among the remaining captives, adjusting their positions, ensuring that the next group to be presented would show to best advantage. The guards at the main house exits had consumed the wine that Bahati had prepared, their movements already showing the slight imprecision that suggested the botanicals were taking effect. The conspirators were in position, each waiting for the signal from Zara's window, each holding the flint and steel that would ignite the ropes that would transform the evening from commerce into conflagration. And then, at exactly 10:43, according to the British naval chronometer that would later be recovered from the ruins, 3 flashes of light appeared in the upper window of the main house. The first fire erupted in the clove stores, a building approximately 40 meters from the main house containing nearly 2 tons of dried spice in wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. The ignition point was perfect, positioned at the base of the oldest and driest section of the stores, where the cloves had been sitting for nearly 14 months awaiting a buyer willing to pay the collector's asking price. The flame spread with a speed that exceeded even Amara's calculations, the volatile oils in the dried cloves creating a fire that burned blue at its heart and orange at its edges, producing smoke so thick that it was visible even in the darkness as a rolling cloud that began advancing toward the main house within seconds of ignition. The second fire erupted simultaneously at the overseer's quarters, a 2-story building that housed Rashid and his staff and contained the weapons and restraints used to maintain order among the enslaved population. This fire spread more slowly, but burned more completely, the wooden internal structures catching and holding heat in ways that stone and coral could not extinguish. The third fire targeted the collector's private warehouse, the building where he stored the most valuable goods awaiting shipment, including ivory, spices, and the records of his commercial operations that documented decades of transactions in human flesh. The fourth and fifth fires closed the 2 primary paths leading away from the compound, creating barriers of flame that transformed the property into something approaching an island, surrounded not by water, but by fire. Inside the main house, the guests' reaction progressed through predictable stages: confusion, concern, and then, as the scope of what was happening became clear, pure animal terror. The collector himself maintained composure for approximately 30 seconds longer than anyone else, long enough to order his guards to investigate, to protect the merchandise, to secure the exits. But the guards were already compromised, their reaction slowed by the botanicals in their wine, their attention fragmented by the multiple fires now visible through every window. Rashid attempted to organize a response, shouting orders that no one followed, his whip useless against flames that cared nothing for his reputation or his methods. The guests rushed toward the main entrance, only to find the approach blocked by the fire consuming the clove stores, the smoke so thick that breathing became impossible within 10 meters of the door. They tried the secondary exits, the servants' passages, the windows that faced the gardens, and found each one presenting some version of the same obstacle. Flames, smoke, or the simple absence of anyone willing to help them escape. The enslaved servants had vanished, as if evaporated, following instructions delivered through channels that no guest had suspected existed. The collector understood, in that moment, what had happened. He understood that this was not accident or fate but design, that the woman he had humiliated in his courtyard 3 weeks earlier had somehow orchestrated an event that would destroy not just his property, but his person, his guests, and the illusion of control that had defined his entire existence. He is reported to have said, in the final minutes before the smoke made speech impossible, a single sentence in Arabic that translates approximately as the fire returns to its source. Whether this represented understanding, acceptance, or simply delirium cannot be determined. The main house burned for nearly 4 hours, the coral stone walls eventually collapsing inward as the wooden floors and roofs they supported disintegrated into ash. Of the 47 guests and guards inside the building when the fires began, 41 died either from the flames directly or from the smoke inhalation that preceded immolation. 6 survived by breaking through a ground floor window facing the sea and swimming to a fishing boat anchored offshore. Their burns so severe that 3 of them died within the following week. The collector's body was never positively identified, though charred remains recovered from the ruins of the main reception room were assumed to be his based on the location and the fragments of jewelry found nearby. In total, the night the island burned claimed 44 lives among the merchant class and their servants, destroyed property valued at approximately 300,000 Maria Theresa thalers, and created a gap in the Zanzibar commercial elite that would take a generation to refill. Amara gathered the survivors near the eastern barracks as the flames consumed the compound behind them, her figure illuminated by firelight that turned her skin to copper and her eyes to mirrors reflecting the destruction she had authored. Nearly 600 enslaved people stood in loose formation, their expressions mixing terror with something that might have been hope, their attention focused entirely on the woman who had demonstrated that the system enslaving them was not invincible. She spoke for approximately 3 minutes, in Swahili that most could understand, and with gestures that communicated to those who could not, explaining what would happen next. The boats belonging to the dead merchants remained in the harbor, damaged but repairable. The smaller dhows could carry 20 to 30 people each, enough to reach the mainland coast at Bagamoyo, within 6 hours of steady sailing. Those who wished to attempt escape should move immediately to the harbor. Those who preferred to remain, calculating that staying might offer better chances of survival than fleeing into unknown territory, should scatter into the island's interior and claim, when questioned, that they had been hiding from the fires and had seen nothing. She did not ask for gratitude. She did not promise safety. She offered only choices and the information necessary to make those choices something other than blind. Approximately 240 people chose to attempt the crossing to the mainland, departing in 7 overloaded boats that reached Bagamoyo over the following 2 days, with the loss of only 12 lives to the rough water and overcrowded conditions. The remainder scattered across the island, disappearing into the population of free Africans and enslaved people, whose status was ambiguous enough to provide cover. Amara herself remained on the island, not from lack of opportunity but from choice. She understood that her work was not complete, that the night the island burned was a beginning rather than an ending, that the method she had developed needed to be transmitted before she allowed herself to consider personal survival. She spent the following weeks moving through the island's network of enslaved communities, teaching what she had learned. The properties of dried cloves as accelerants, the timing calculations for delayed ignition, the strategies for disabling guards without alerting them to the attack until too late, the importance of establishing escape routes before setting fires rather than relying on improvisation afterward. She called this body of knowledge by the same name she had given the original plan, the phrase in her father's language that meant the return of fire. Within 3 months, this name had become an organizing principle for resistance, a method that would spread throughout the East African coast and eventually influence similar actions as far away as Arabia and the Indian Ocean islands. The response from colonial authorities exceeded anything Amara could have anticipated in its speed, its coordination, and its determination to eliminate not just the immediate threat, but the memory that such a threat had ever existed. Within 48 hours of the main house collapse, the British consul in Zanzibar had dispatched messages to the naval patrol requesting immediate reinforcement. The new sultan, Sayyid Khalid bin Said, still consolidating power after his father's death earlier that year, issued orders for the immediate arrest of any enslaved person found outside their designated location without authorization. Armed patrols swept through the island's villages and plantations, conducting interrogations that frequently escalated into torture and summary execution. The official narrative that emerged from these efforts placed responsibility for the fires on a combination of accident and opportunistic violence, attributing the deaths to a tragic confluence of circumstances rather than organized resistance. The British consular reports, preserved in the National Archives in London, described the June catastrophe as an unfortunate incident resulting from the careless storage of combustible materials and the subsequent panic that led to preventable deaths among individuals trapped by circumstances beyond their control. No mention of conspiracy, no mention of planning, no mention of the woman who had designed and executed the entire operation. The Omani court records, held in Muscat until their transfer to the Zanzibar archives in the 20th century, contain even less information. Their entries for June 1844 limited to brief notations about property losses and the need for increased security measures. It was as if the authorities of 3 different powers, British, Omani, and the emerging Zanzibari administration, had independently reached the same conclusion: that the truth of what had occurred was more dangerous than any lie they might construct to replace it. The manhunt for those responsible continued throughout the summer and into the fall, intensifying as reports reached Stone Town of similar incidents occurring elsewhere. A plantation on Pemba Island burned under suspicious circumstances in late July, the fire beginning in the spice stores and spreading to the main house in a pattern that exactly replicated the Zanzibar events. A merchant vessel returning from the Kilwa coast reported an attempted boarding by formerly enslaved people who had established a camp on one of the coastal islands and were demanding provisions under threat of attack. A letter from the British consul in Muscat described rumors circulating among the Arab trading community of a female figure, possibly mythological, who was teaching enslaved populations a method of resistance involving fire and coordinated action. The Sultan's forces responded with increasing brutality, conducting mass punishments of enslaved populations on any plantation where suspicious activity was reported, regardless of whether any evidence connected the residents to actual resistance. The price for information about the woman known variously as the fire-bringer, the iron worker, or simply the teacher, rose to $1,000, more than had ever been offered for the capture of any fugitive in East African history. Amara evaded capture through a combination of constant movement, carefully cultivated allies, and the simple reality that no official document contained any description of her appearance, no sketch or portrait existed, no record of her purchase by the collector had survived the fire that consumed his archives. She existed in the administrative records only as an absence, a gap where information should have been, a name that had somehow never been entered into any of the ledgers and inventories that typically tracked enslaved people with the precision of accounting for any other valuable commodity. This administrative invisibility, which had originated in the chaotic conditions of her original capture and transport, now provided protection that no physical concealment could have matched. The authorities were hunting for a ghost, a legend, a story that enslaved people whispered to each other in the darkness of barracks and holding cells, and they were finding only that the story grew larger with each failed attempt to capture its subject. The final confrontation came in late October, when the Sultan's forces received information from an informant that the woman they sought was sheltering in a fishing village on the island's eastern coast. a location where several known escape boats had departed in the weeks following the June fires. A force of approximately 60 soldiers surrounded the village before dawn, blocking all exits and beginning a systematic search of each dwelling. Amara was not present, had not been present for 3 days, but her sister Zara was. Zara had remained in the village to coordinate the departure of another group of escapees, a boat scheduled to leave that very morning, carrying 27 people to the mainland coast. She was captured within the first 10 minutes of the search, identified by a domestic servant from the collector's household who had been brought along specifically to recognize any of the conspirators from the main house. The soldiers tortured her throughout the day, demanding information about her sister's location that she did not possess and would not have revealed if she had. They broke her fingers first, then her arms, then began on methods that left no bones intact to break. She died sometime in the late afternoon, having spoken no word that provided any useful intelligence. Her body was displayed in Stonetown's main square for 3 days, a warning to any who might consider similar resistance, before being removed to an unmarked burial site that has never been identified. Amara learned of her sister's death 2 days later, from a messenger who found her at a safe house in the island's northern highlands. The account of what happened next comes from a single source, a man named Baraka, who served as one of her most trusted lieutenants, and who survived to provide testimony to an American missionary in 1879. According to Baraka, Amara listened to the full account of Zara's capture, torture, and death without any visible reaction, her face maintaining the same calm expression she wore when planning operations or teaching the methods of fire-based resistance. When the messenger finished speaking, she asked 3 questions. First, were any of the 27 escapees captured? The answer was no. The boat had departed before the soldiers arrived. Second, did Zara reveal any information before she died? The answer was no. She had maintained silence throughout. Third, where was the informant who had betrayed the village's location? This question the messenger could not answer, but another member of the network present at the safe house could. The informant was a man named Jabir, a free trader who had been providing intelligence to the Sultan's forces in exchange for commercial advantages in the clove trade. He was currently in Stonetown, celebrating his reward at a drinking establishment near the waterfront. Amara nodded, asked for directions to the establishment, and left the safe house alone. She never returned. What happened in Stonetown that night has been reconstructed from fragments. A fire at the drinking establishment that claimed 4 lives, including Jabir's, reports of a woman matching no known description seen leaving the area, and the discovery the following morning of a body on the beach north of the city that the authorities identified, without sufficient evidence, as the firebringer herself. The body was too badly burned for positive identification, a fact that some historians have interpreted as convenient for officials eager to close a file that had become embarrassing. The official report declared the matter concluded, the threat eliminated, the resistance suppressed. Subsequent events suggest this conclusion was premature. The years following 1844 saw the spread of what became known as the clove fire method throughout the East African slave trade network, a propagation that official suppression completely failed to prevent. Plantations burned in Pemba, in the Comoro Islands, in coastal territories from Mozambique to Somalia. The pattern was always the same: fires beginning in stored agricultural products, spreading to main houses and administrative buildings, occurring during gatherings that concentrated targets in vulnerable locations. British naval reports from the period contain increasingly alarmed references to a phenomenon they variously called the fire contagion, or the Zanzibar disease, treating the spread of resistance techniques as if they were pathological rather than political. The Omani authorities responded with architectural changes, requiring that new plantation buildings incorporate fire breaks and that stored products be kept in isolated structures distant from living quarters. These measures reduced the effectiveness of direct replication, but did nothing to address the underlying transformation that Amara's example had catalyzed. The demonstration that organized resistance was possible, that the system enslaving millions of people could be attacked successfully, that those who profited from human misery were not invulnerable to the rage they had cultivated through their cruelty. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1844 and 1873, when the British finally forced the closure of Zanzibar's slave market, At least 37 separate incidents following the clove fire pattern occurred throughout the region, resulting in over 200 deaths among the merchant class and the destruction of property valued at more than 4 million thalers. Liberal estimates place the numbers significantly higher, but many incidents were never officially recorded, either because authorities preferred to classify them as accidents or because the locations were sufficiently remote that no official ever investigated at all. The British consul Charles Rigby, writing in 1860, described the ongoing phenomenon as a constant factor in our negotiations with the Sultan regarding the gradual suppression of the slave trade, noting that each incident strengthened arguments for abolition by demonstrating that the trade was not merely immoral but increasingly dangerous to those who practiced it. The 1873 treaty that closed the Zanzibar market was motivated by many factors, but historians have noted that the cumulative impact of decades of fire-based resistance created conditions that made abolition more palatable to commercial interests than continued exposure to the risks of the existing system. The question of what happened to Amara herself has never been definitively answered, generating a body of folklore, speculation, and deliberate myth-making that continues to the present day. The official position, maintained by successive administrations and repeated in most historical accounts, is that she died in Stone Town on the night she avenged her sister's death. Her body, the burned remains, found on the beach the following morning. This narrative has the advantage of simplicity and closure, providing an ending that satisfies the basic requirements of storytelling while conveniently eliminating any need to explain her absence from subsequent events. But oral traditions preserved among East African coastal communities tell different stories, stories that spread through channels the authorities never successfully controlled, and that acquired additional details with each generation of retelling. Some of these traditions claim that Amara escaped to the mainland, making her way inland to the lake country where she had been born, living the remainder of her life as a free woman under a different name in communities that had no knowledge of her previous existence. Others suggest that she established a school of sorts in the forested highlands of Tanganyika, training others in the methods she had developed and sending them back to the coast to continue the work of resistance. A particularly persistent tradition holds that she survived until the 1870s, witnessing from concealment the official abolition of the Zanzibar slave market and dying only when she had confirmed that the system she had fought against was finally, formally, ended. None of these stories can be verified. All of them might be true. The woman who had been systematically erased from official records left no diary, no letters, no documents that could establish her movements or her fate after that night in Stone Town. She exists in history only as an absence, a void in the archives where a person should be, and perhaps this is exactly what she intended. The authorities who tried to erase her succeeded in eliminating her from their records, but in doing so, they transformed her into something more powerful than any documented historical figure could have become. A story that belongs to no archive, and therefore cannot be contained, controlled, or concluded. In the years since, the physical traces of the June 1844 events have been progressively obscured by development, decay, and deliberate concealment. The site of the collector's plantation was subdivided in the 1890s, the ruins of the main house cleared, and the land converted to smaller agricultural operations that showed no evidence of the structures that had once stood there. The coral stone walls that survived the fire were broken up and reused as building material throughout the island, their molecular structure still containing the carbon residue of that night's conflagration, but carrying no labels identifying their origin. The British cathedral built over the slave market site in 1873 still stands, its altar positioned, according to the bishop who consecrated it, directly above the whipping post where the most recalcitrant captives had been punished. Tourists photograph this altar daily without understanding what lies beneath, what the concrete and consecrated ground were designed to obscure and sanctify. In the Zanzibar National Archives, the locked cabinet requiring 3 keys still exists, its contents officially listed as administrative records of the Sultanate of Zanzibar, period 1840-1850, access restricted pending cataloging. Applications for access to these documents have been denied for over 50 years, with explanations varying from preservation concerns to pending historical review, to simple bureaucratic silence. One researcher who attempted to access the cabinet in 2019 reported being told by an archival official that some history is better left undisturbed, though when pressed for elaboration, the official claimed to have been speaking philosophically rather than specifically about the documents in question. What the cabinet contains remains unknown. That it contains something the authorities of 3 successive governments have agreed to keep hidden is itself a form of evidence, a testament to the power of events that occurred 180 years ago. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of Amara touched your heart. Share so that the memory of Amara is never forgotten.